I also just want to make sure that I'm pronouncing everybody's names correctly. And, when you grow up with a name like Macadot, you get a little sensitive to having your name mispronounced. So help me out with the pronunciations, the correct pronunciations.
Yeah, so yeah, it's also good if you mispronounce it. I mean, I think that most people mispronounce it. So Flore Bridoux.
Bridoux. Okay.
Yeah.
Flore Bridoux. Okay. And
yeah, well, that is really good.
Okay.
You're imitating the French accent.
I took a little bit of French in high school. I can remember Je m'appelle Richard, and that's about all I can remember. JW, how are we pronouncing your name?
So the JW part is the easy part, obviously, which is why I only use the initials to begin with.
Okay.
Stoelhorst.
Stoelhorst.
Stoelhorst. Yeah.
Stoelhorst. Okay.
Horst, yeah. Stoelhorst. Very good.
I'm going to mess this up. I know I'm going to mess it up. Flore.
Rich, you can also make a joke of it and just say that you are going to ask us to say our own names because all these Europeans.
I want to get it. Flore Bridoux.
Yeah.
And J.W. Stoelhorst. No,
Horst. Yeah, that's good. Stoelhorst. Yeah.
Stoelhorst.
Yeah, that's good.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Academy Management Review's Origins Series. My name is Rich Macadot. I am an associate editor at AMR, as well as a professor of management at the Purdue University's Krannert School of Management, and I am your host for this series. On today's episode, we have Flore Bridoux and J.W. I'm going to have to edit this. On today's episode, we have Flore. If I can get past the names, I'll be okay. On today's episode, our guests are Flore Bridoux and J.W. Our guests for today's episode are Flore Bridoux and J.W. Stoelhorst, who together are the authors of a forthcoming AMR article called Stakeholder Governance, Solving the Collective Action Problems in Joint Value Creation. Welcome to the AMR Origins Series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit very briefly about the manuscript. What is your brief 1-minute elevator pitch for this manuscript? Just give a brief explanation.
So this paper is about stakeholder governance, and I think the interest in that topic has something to do with a recent, what you could call stakeholder turn in the literature. There's many more academics questioning traditional shareholder primacy views of governance, including strategy scholars, which are maybe not the first ones that you would think would go a stakeholder route. And there's also practitioners who are more and more interested in that, including the Business Roundtable CEOs who signed something about a stakeholder approach. But then, of course, the question is, what does that mean? And we've been doing joint work on these sorts of topics for a while, especially from the point of view of understanding cooperation. And one of the themes in our work, and also the work of others that has popped up, is that stakeholder governance is very much about solving collective action problems. It's not just about cooperation, but cooperation in the face of collective action problems. And once you realize that, then the work of Elinor Ostrom comes to mind, because she actually studied that in detail, won a Nobel Prize for it.
Naturally, yes.
So in this paper, we use Ostrom's work to think through a bit more how you might govern stakeholders. And I think one of the interesting things there is that if you use Ostrom's work, you begin to question the standard idea in stakeholder theory, which is of a hub and spoke system, where managers are sort of at the center and firms are at the center of everything. And building on Ostrom's work, we then also developed 2 other ways in which you could govern stakeholders to solve these collective action problems. And that's basically what we develop in more detail in the paper.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me ask you to take a slightly deeper dive into what the paper does. Okay, so this is figure 1 from the paper. Tell us a little bit about what this figure is telling us.
Yeah, so in the paper, we discussed 3 stakeholder governance forms. The hub and spoke one that has been described in the literature for a long time, but that had never been really looked at, so in the stakeholder theory literature, but that has never really been looked at as a governance form. So we also dive into that form, in fact, and then we identify 2 governance forms based on Ostrom's work, the lead governance form and the shared governance form. And how we look at these forms, we look at them through the design principles of Elinor Ostrom. So Ostrom did a lot of work on local communities, and she also meta-analyzed the work of many other people. So her work is really built on a very, very large body of empirical evidence. And based on that, she realized that it's not possible to identify the best governance rules to maintain cooperation in the face of collective action problems, but that if you respect 8 design principles in making your rules, then you can maintain cooperation. And why you need this freedom there is because collective action problems are not the same. They vary very much. So rules need to be adapted to the local circumstances, as she calls it. So it will take these 8 design principles, not all 8 here, but we take the design principles that are at the collective level, community level, so not the ones that are related to higher order institutions. We take the design principles and we use them to look at these 3 governance forms here. And we see that they really very much differ. For instance, who makes the decisions related to governance? Well, in the hub and spoke governance form, the idea is very much that you have the firm and its managers at the center. They make the governance rules. We look only at managing 4 stakeholders. So we assume that managers and the firm here at the center aim for balancing stakeholders' interests, but they decide how to do it, and they try to do it the best possible to reach this objective. In the lead role governance form, that's quite different. In fact, the firm and its managers are mandated by the other stakeholders to take this role of leader in governance. However, it stays a mandate. So if other stakeholders are not satisfied with the leader they have chosen, they can replace the leader. And in the last form, it's really shared. So all the stakeholders participate in a relatively equal basis in making governance rules. So that is one of the design principles. Then we look at other design principles, who monitors and sanctions, because obviously if you have governance rules, it's very important that they are implemented, that the actors keep to them. Otherwise you have no solution to your collective action problems. And here again, the actor I just mentioned played these different roles. In the hub and spoke form, this really the manager and firm at the center that will enforce the rules, really in this dyadic relationship with the stakeholders. So they monitor each stakeholder separately and very much they enforce the rules. While in fact, the lead role governance form, it's mostly the managers of the firm, but stakeholders also keep monitoring each other. So there is more control, if you want. You build on the fact that they are behind a community, and so that stakeholders who are involved in joint value creation activities together have the opportunity to see what others are doing, and so could also monitor and sanction. And in the shared governance form, everybody is really the idea of peer monitoring. Everybody is monitoring and sanctioning everybody else, which has advantages, but it also could be very costly if you want a team of stakeholders is growing very much, that becomes very cumbersome. We also look at who is resolving conflict and what type of conflict resolution mode is used. And here too, I mean, every time we apply a design principle, we see that there are clear differences. On one extreme, for instance, the hub and spoke governance form, you really have, again, the managers resolving conflicts. What is interesting is they could, depending on how the stakeholders are behaving, because it's all dyadic, apply different conflict resolution modes. So with very cooperative stakeholders, well, they can have very cooperative conflict resolution modes. Mm-hmm. And when there is a conflict, we don't really understand the rule very much. We come together, we discuss the rule to clarify. But if one stakeholder is behaving opportunistically, then it can become a much more aggressive form of conflict resolution, where in fact, really mm-hmm. And so while in the shared governance form, to give another example, it's really very cooperative mode of conflict resolution. There is not this possibility to go towards a more aggressive mode, which means that this form, in fact, works well with, in all the cases where stakeholders are all cooperative, if you want, collaborative in the mindset, but will have more difficulties dealing with conflict resolution when some stakeholders are opportunistic. What is interesting when we go beyond the design principles, because we also try to do that in the paper, is that the role of the managers are quite different in these three forms. In the first one, the traditional one for us in stakeholder theory, the hub and spoke, managers are really these benevolent patriarchs. They are the fathers taking care of the stakeholders, if you want. In the lead role governance, they become leaders, but they are chosen leaders, and they can be demoted also. And in the shared governance form, wow, they are one among many. They are not that important anymore. They have to deal with others on an equal footing. So that's the type of, and we also develop ideas around trust, and we don't have time to develop everything here, but we have like that different ideas around these three forms being different in many respects.
Now you mentioned that Ostrom herself said there was no single best governance form, and in that spirit, you developed some propositions in the paper about when each of these three governance forms might be best. So this is your table 3 from the paper, where you develop those propositions about the conditions under which each of the three governance forms might work best. Why don't you talk us through this table a little bit and explain how it relates to the propositions?
Yeah, so I mean, very much the idea of Ostrom was that when you face different collective action problems, so action problems with different characteristics, you are going to need different rules. So we use the idea here to reflect on the working of the different forms and their efficiency into solving the collective action problems, and so fostering joint value creation. And we look only at 2 characteristics. We could have looked at many more, but there is a limit to the paper here too. So we're not claiming at all exhaustivity, but we looked at 2 characteristics that we think are important in the strategy field, which is the complexity of activities stakeholders engaging, and the dynamism. So the need to adapt over time, the joint value creation activities. And we just then reflect really on how this different governance form can deal with that. In terms of complexity, we think that the shared governance form has an advantage because it builds as much as possible on all what stakeholders know, given that they're all involved in governance in a very equal footing. All the information they have can come to bear on the governance rules. The lowest in that is being the hub and spoke governance form, because the managers are at the center and they make the governance rules. So they can only adapt them to the extent that they have the information, that the information is coming from the stakeholders. And they have this limited cognitive capacity in putting all this information together to create the best governance rules. In terms of dynamism, we really look into learning. And it will not surprise you that the forms differ here too. And yeah, the shared governance form has the, in that sense, disadvantage in terms of learning that is slow. It's accurate because of building all this information that stakeholders have, but it's slow. I mean, if you have to make decisions together, you know, yeah, consent based on form of consensus, yeah, it takes a long time. For the hub and spoke governance form, we also say it's moderate, but exactly because of the contrary, it can be very fast, but the managers only have so much information, so it moves fast, but maybe less accurately. And we claim that the lead role governance has a bit of both worlds, a bit of speed and some accuracy, and so yeah, perform best. But it's all comparative. So it's higher than the others.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Maybe, Rich, one small thing to add here is that when we did this exercise, what you see is that the most traditional way of thinking about it, at least the way stakeholder theory would traditionally think about governance, which is this hub and spoke system, is on neither of these two dimensions it's the most efficient.
Right.
These other two forms seem to, at least according to the analysis, seem to have advantages over the traditional form.
Right.
Which at least helps, you know, show a little bit the relevance of the exercise.
So the literature has been focused on what is perhaps the least efficient way of handling this problem. Yes, that's at least what our analysis would suggest, that there may in fact be clear advantages of considering these other two forms. That is interesting.
As complexity goes up, as dynamism goes up.
Right.
You know? Which takes us away from the traditional idea of thinking about governance in the firm. I remember that when our editor, Jay Barney, sent the acceptance email, one of the things that he said, what I really like about the paper, and this refers to the figure 1 that we looked at, is how the firm recedes into the distance, into the background, I think he said.
Yes.
Yeah? So it really it begins to change the way you think about the role of firms in this bigger picture and the role of managers. At least Barney, at least that's what Jay.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense, and I think that is a big thing that makes this paper interesting. So, who's the target audience or audiences for this paper? Who should read it?
Well, short of everybody.
Well, I mean, obviously stakeholder theorists, but we think that it's of interest to strategy scholars who are interested in governance, obviously. Also, strategy scholars interested in inter-organizational relationships. After all, you can apply all this thinking to alliances, for instance. And in this literature also inspired our work, in fact. You also have, more and more scholars in strategy are interested in stakeholder theory. They will not become stakeholder theorists, but so this is targeted to all these people.
Right, and I can see how Jay would be particularly interested in this paper, given his 2018 SMJ article, which basically takes the perspective that when you take seriously the idea that there are these collective action problems in value creation, then you necessarily must have a stakeholder perspective underlying resource-based logic. So I can certainly understand why he would appreciate that. So I think anybody who's who from the strategy field who finds that a compelling argument. So people who are interested in the resource-based view and interested in understanding the origins of competitive advantage, and who are grappling with the fact that there are collective action problems underlying the origins of competitive advantage, should definitely read this article, because I think it takes a step forward in that direction. Great. So this is the AMR Origins Series. I'm pointing in the right direction there. And so we definitely like to ask questions about the origins of the papers that get published in the AMR. We do this for the benefit of newer researchers, younger scholars who may never have published a theory paper, may never have even considered publishing a theory paper. but to help them get an understanding of where does theory come from. So, you know, and I think there's no single answer to that question either. Theory comes from many different places in many different cases. So, you know, in this series, we like to be able to present, you know, a menu of different places that theory can come from for each of these different papers. So where did this paper come from? How did this project get started? Where did you get the idea for it?
Yeah, so I mean, the topic for us is not new. We have been interested in cooperation in the face of collective action problems, stakeholder relationships for a while. So in that sense, yeah, that comes from our line of work. And I read Ostrom a long time ago, I have to say. And since the beginning, I was fascinated by her work. But it took me a long time to figure out how to use it, or to maybe dare really jump and really try using our work beyond that, the obvious, there is a collective action problem type of message. And so, yes, the paper here started really with the idea, I want to use it, I feel now I dare. So I want to use it, yeah, clearly to address cooperation among stakeholders. Yes, and then from there was and to do what exactly?
Right.
Beyond, yeah, and that took some thinking. And I have to say, if we can say a bit more, that initially it was not about, indirectly it was about stakeholder governance, but so we submitted to this special issue on the future of capitalism that J. Barney and others were editing. So we really try to use Ostrom to say something about capitalism as it is. And as you can see, there is not much of capitalism left in the paper.
Right.
So initially, we use it as a lens to look at the traditional narrative of capitalism and shareholder primacy. And the reviewers were not all that enthusiastic about the ideas. So in the revision process, we deeply changed the paper in terms of repositioning it. They told us it's better to focus on the collective of stakeholders. They say firm level, but okay, we understood it as collective of stakeholders, and not so much try to talk about higher level institutions as we were trying to do.
There's maybe, if I can comment on that, there's maybe a general lesson for prospective AMR authors in our little experience there. Of course, we have published in AMR before, and we review for the journal, so we sort of know what we're doing. But even we went too broad and maybe lured in a little bit by the topic of the special issue, wanting to talk about the idea of capitalism and basically sort of putting shareholder primacy on its head. And I remember one of the comments of a reviewer after the first version who said, it's all very interesting, but this is a pamphlet. It's not a theory paper. and he was at least partly right. I mean, we could even see where he was coming from. So we, like Flore said, we drastically cut down and narrowed the focus really just on a contribution to stakeholder theory, stakeholder governance thinking. And right now we're writing a book chapter on these other wild ideas about.
Okay.
But there's a lesson there, I think, about what an AMR paper is or can be and whatnot. It needs to at least be positioned in a way that your reviewers can see that you're talking to a clear specific problem, and you're not taking on the whole world as we sort of seem to be doing, at least according to one of the reviewers.
The exposition about capitalism survives in the paper at a part where you talk about joint value creation as being the, quote, delicate engine of capitalism. It's the phrase that you use. And it's delicate because joint value creation is a collective action problem. And that's what makes it delicate. And I think that's an interesting perspective on capitalism, right? Because, for example, in more socialist systems, there's less of a collective action problem because everything is mandated, right? You're just told what to do, and you don't have to kind of participate in working out those details for yourself in collaboration with others. So it is. I think that's a useful insight that the joint value, insofar as capitalism relies on joint value creation, and not in a way that is centrally planned, it means that that there is always going to be a collective action problem involved to be solved, and that will require the participation of the actors to solve it, right? And that is, I think, that is somewhat delicate. So I think you hit the nail on the head with that phrase. So am I reading the paper correctly? Is that right?
Yeah, no, you're reading it completely correctly. And I think it's the biggest message, or the most important message of Elinor Ostrom, is indeed that the solution is not per se centralization. And I mean, my feeling is that I hear more and more often strategy scholars say we need more regulation. I'm very surprised because of the 10, 15 years ago, we were not talking about that. But that is a form of centralization again.
Yes.
And the work of Ostrom would question that. You really need centralization. Are really regulators going to be so clever? Like again, our managers at the center of the hub and spoke system, that they will develop the best governance rules. Well, we question that also indirectly, because we don't tackle that really. But yes, it has implications. This thinking of Ostrom for a lot of other things that strategy scholars are now discussing.
There is something in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech where she basically almost explains her Nobel Prize as being for the work that she's done to break open what she calls a two systems view. So the traditional idea is either we have markets or we have centralized government. And if you really think of economic theory, then both of these forms have been modeled in a very idealized way. And Ostrom's message is, in an important sense, you don't have perfect markets, you don't have perfect centralization. What you have is polycentricity. It's all solving collective action problems in different ways, and somehow firms are part of that mix. And this, I think, for me, completely changes the way of thinking about governance. And I think it's something that not just we, but also some other strategy scholars are sort of beginning to hit on, in thinking, yeah, if it is about collective action, if you think about what people like Ostrom have been saying, you really have a completely different perspective on governance than the traditional economic views, where it's either pure market or pure centralization. Firms have central authority, there is a collective, but it's not socialism. Mm-hmm. So thinking that through, based on her work and other work about solving collective action problems, without sort of going to these idealized extremes of a pure market or a benevolent government, I think is very interesting for us as a field.
So, okay, so you started with the topic in general, which you had a long-standing interest in, right? And you grabbed onto this attractive tool, which I'll call it, which is Ostrom's design principles. These nine design principles, right? So this was this very attractive tool, and you tried to do something very big with those nine that tool of those nine principles. And the reviewers told you, no, do something a little bit more focused with that tool. But somewhere along the line, you had to have introduced this idea of the three modes of stakeholder governance. Where did that idea come from? Because that, so far in your story, you haven't told us where that really central piece of the paper came from.
I don't even know.
You don't know. Yeah, I mean, in the stress of the revision process, it came. Yeah, it's a good question, and that doesn't come mean, yes, it comes from Ostrom. It comes from maybe reading Ostrom differently than I see most other people read it. Is to see that there are two forms in Ostrom, which people usually only see the shared governance form, but when she describes the communities, she also very much talks about communities that have leaders that are chosen and that are usually obviously the old wise people. And to think, oh no, there are two forms. And when I think about two forms, and I read also the literature on stakeholder networks, I see a parallel, there are also papers on network governance, not a lot. There are 2 or 3, that's very, very few. But okay, that resonates. We see all these forms there. And then that was the start of that part and thinking, okay, now I can look at it with the design principles. So yeah, that may be the spark of creativity that you must be lucky to have along the way, because we are in the revision. We needed to change fundamentally the paper in that respect. But it's, I think it's about, knowing what you are talking about. So we are talking about, cooperation among stakeholders. I had in the back of my mind some knowledge about that. And it comes from, I mean, this usual thing, creativity is putting pieces of knowledge together. And I think it's really that about knowing these two fields and putting the knowledge together.
Okay, cool. So it sounds like they pushed you to apply Ostrom's tools more narrowly, and you had to figure out, okay, well, what do we apply it to? And
yes.
I can read Ostrom a little bit more carefully and see if there's something there, and you were able to distinguish multiple forms of stakeholder governance from her work and characterize them and develop them into kind of a typology, which I think is an important contribution of the paper. Great. So tell us a little bit about what was it that made this project interesting enough to you for you to want to devote your time and effort to it?
Well, the original idea was probably that we could talk at a very high level about capitalism and its problems, and especially the problems as when you look at it exclusively through sort of a neoclassical economic perspective. And usually I'm the one that gets really excited by these big picture papers, but this time it was actually Flore who was in the lead, and normally she sort of tells me to narrow things down, and now we all of a sudden were in the opposite way of working, where she had big ideas. She wanted to take on all of governance, and I said maybe we need a bit of more focus. And then of course the reviewers came in and really hammered it down that we should focus more. So at least originally there was also the excitement of, look, here's an AMR special topic forum about a really big big topic, and they are waiting also for big statements. That I think was the original excitement. And then in the end it became a much more traditional theory paper, which we had written before. But I think that's originally where the excitement comes from. But having said that, I think that what we end up doing still feeds into a stream of research where other people like Jay, Barney, we mentioned it, but Peter Klein, John Mahoney, Anita McKay, and Christos Pitelis have been going in a similar direction. So there was stuff that we could still sort of link to that was even still exciting enough when we narrowed it down. But originally it was about saving capitalism from the capitalists.
Okay. Did you want to add something, Flore?
Yeah, I want that, and then just, using Elinor Ostrom's work is an exciting thing to do because of how clever it is. And there are so many other facets to her work. So I'm still working on some other, there's much more than the design principles for whoever doesn't know Ostrom's work. So go and have a look. There is so much there that can be used in management.
So many theory papers, I guess maybe increasingly over time, are becoming are our co-authored projects, joint projects, team projects even. The day of the lone theorist may be behind us, I'm not sure. But it seems like there, you know, a lot of the papers that I edit for AMR are involving larger and larger author teams collaborating with each other. So I know that the two of you have been long-standing collaborators for literally for decades. What can you tell us about the process of collaborating on a theory project in particular? Is there anything different about collaborating on a theory project for maybe for AMR versus an empirical project that people can learn from?
You want to start? Or?
Yeah, maybe it's really different from in an empirical project. I feel that often we tend to divide the work. You know, there is somebody who specializes in maybe, I don't know, collecting, analyzing the data, and one is more specialized in building the theory. And here it is, yeah, it is good work. I mean, in my feeling, if you do it together. So you need to kind of really, expose your work to the feedback of the other. Really listen carefully, which I'm not that good at, it seems, says my co-author here, and then integrate this.
And she returns the favor.
Yeah, so integrate these insights that you get and to really improve, and because you really need to take that next step. If you by yourself, you stay I think at a level that is below the level expected by AMR these days. So confronting your ideas, and yes, it can be with co-authors. I suppose it could be with others. It doesn't have to be co-authors, but co-authors have some motivation to help you in kind of pushing you to kind of clarify that's the minimum. But usually they just challenge you to move in another direction, to reposition, to here it was maybe narrowed down. You are too ambitious. It's out of proportion. It's really in the dialogue. I feel that the paper is improving.
Right. So dialogue is more important, perhaps, for a theory paper, and there's perhaps more complementarities involved in the process of developing theory than in developing an empirical paper. I would believe that. J.W., you had something else to add?
Yeah. Well, if I just reflect on when the two of us work together, we also had to learn that, because we really upset each other in the early days of trying to work together quite a lot. Although we both realized that the work was getting better, it was not easy. And I think one of the things for theory papers is you need to be able to disagree. And in order to be able to disagree without it becoming a fight or a personal thing, you probably need enough of a shared view of things so that you recognize where the disagreement is coming from. I think if you don't have enough of a shared view of things, or enough of a shared understanding of certain literatures, then when somebody disagrees with you, you're quite quick to dismiss the disagreement as to they don't know what they're talking about. But if you know that you have a similar perspective, and you've read largely the same literature, then it becomes easier to say, okay, maybe there is something here. And if you also don't take criticism personally, then the ideas keep developing. So for us, I think that it works because we have many shared interests and a shared view of things. To some degree, there's some differences too. And then on top of that, it's easier to sometimes disagree, to say, no, you're not making sense. And then realizing that if you allow that going back and forth, that it becomes better.
So I will confess, I have a little bit of a cowardly way of managing those disagreements with my co-authors. I would, instead of stating my objection forthrightly as being my objection, I would say something like, if this paper gets sent to a reviewer of type X, right? If this paper gets sent to a transaction cost reviewer, then that reviewer would probably say this about what you're doing, right? Or if this paper gets sent to a resource-based researcher, right? That reviewer would probably say this, or if it gets sent to a human capital reviewer, right? That person would say this. And so I tend to frame it in terms of what would a hypothetical reviewer say coming from a particular perspective. And that way I don't have to take full ownership of my criticism. So that's my cowardly way of handling it.
Maybe we should try.
Or maybe I should try being more honest. So, okay. So do you want to talk a little bit about what each of you contributed to this project and how those pieces fit together to form the completed whole?
Well, it's collective action, huh? And in collective action, it is very difficult to measure the individual inputs, but it was the idea for the paper was Flore's. So it starts with her.
Yes, well, yeah. And this paper, it was maybe more, I created first drafts and J.W. gave feedback, which is one way of working. We have been working differently on other papers where we're really much more co-creating drafts, if you want. So that has been a bit different here. And then, yeah, J.W. always rewrites the introductions and that also discussions that he likes a lot. The bigger picture, he said so before. He's the bigger picture guy normally. So.
Okay. So now I have this question in my usual list of questions, which is what were the biggest challenges that you faced on the project? It seems like you may have answered that already in terms of the feedback you got from the reviewers about taking on too big of a topic. But let me ask, beyond that one particularly big challenge, were there any other challenges that were worth noting, and maybe you could tell us what they were and how you overcame them, if there were any others?
Yeah, I think there is a challenge that maybe generalizes beyond our paper in using ideas from outside of the management field. So, and bring these ideas to applying these ideas, or transforming. You're also transforming as you're applying, given how far they are coming from. That's usually an exercise that takes some time, and that is challenging to do. Because these ideas need to be transformed enough that they can make sense for the topic we're talking about. And we were a little bit challenged, not a lot, I would say, but we were a little bit challenged by the reviewers but does Ostrom's work really apply? Can you say something about, joint value creation by stakeholders based on Ostrom's work on fisheries and forests? Well, happily, she has also claimed that her work is generalizable, and others have done so too. So it was easy to counter that argument, but I can imagine that others would even have more. For some other theories, it would be something to really work on to show the usefulness and the applicability.
So how did you overcome that challenge? What did you do when faced with that?
Yeah, so we explained better, because we already had the arguments. We explained better that, it's not only fisheries, it's not only forests, but her later work is really applying it more generally than some to other challenges, still not in the management field at all, but to other economic problems that are much closer. Others have also used her work. So, I mean, there are already a few other people in management who have used your work. That's an easy solution to that problem, to be honest. So that we use a number of tricks to get that accepted. Okay.
So let me, just for my last question, let me take the conversation in a somewhat different direction, which is looking forward. What impact do you hope that this paper will have in the future? And I ask this in terms of, it's perhaps a multi-part question, because I think any AMR paper can have potentially 5 different types of impact. It could have impact on future theory, perhaps other AMR papers that will be written in the future. It could have impact on future empirical research, perhaps papers that might get published in AMJ someday. It could have influence on future practice, on future pedagogy, or perhaps even on future policy. So I think the Academy has a journal on each of these 5 topics. So potentially papers in any of these 5 journals could emerge. But what do you think? What impact do you hope that this paper will have in any of those areas? You don't have to answer for all 5, but maybe just pick a couple and talk about what impact do you hope it will have.
Well, in the theory, I mean, I hope it becomes part of a conversation. There is a conversation that is emerging on stakeholder governance. I hope it is one piece of this conversation, and as such is taken on by others as and combined with the rest to create new theories. That would be great. I hope also that some people who do maybe one step towards practice. It's obviously an AMR piece. It's not like a toolkit for practitioners to go and implement these 3 forms. But I would love if some researchers who are doing case studies take this paper and use it as a lens to look at their case studies and then get more practical insights for then practitioners, seeing the translation into what can then managers in these 3 forms do. That would be, there's a couple. I mean, if that happens, I'm already very happy.
Yeah, maybe I can add one thing, because one thing that also comes to mind is that in the end, what we do in this paper is apply it at a relatively high level of analysis. So we're looking at 3 different ways in which firms can and their managers can play a role in governing collective action problems. But of course, the way we typically think about governance of firms is in terms of corporate governance. Mm-hmm. And I think there's all kinds of very interesting questions in thinking through corporate governance as we typically think of it, very much informed by that traditional thinking coming from economics, and sort of confront that with Ostrom's ideas about governance. If it is really the case that firms are ultimately about solving collective action problems, and if Ostrom's rules are a very good general guide for solving them, then that also offers a lens to really start thinking differently about traditional ideas and traditional corporate governance practices, for instance. And we haven't done that in this paper. The original, much bigger taking on capitalism version had a little bit of that in the background. But my hope would be that as part of this bigger conversation that Flore is also mentioning, that we are really beginning to rethink how we see firms and managers and their role in not just creating value the way we think of it as strategy, but ultimately creating welfare for society as a whole. And it goes back to what I said earlier about these traditional views where it's all market or all centralized government. It's sort of an extreme version of privatized capitalism versus an extreme version of socialism. But the real world is maybe in between. And I think taking Ostrom seriously is the beginning of looking that in the eye, seeing that it's all about collective action, and firms are just part of that. Of course, the question is, does what she did for fisheries and forestries, etc., does it really translate to firms all the way? Mm-hmm. Or are there at some points things that we as strategy, organization, corporate governance scholars have to say that are specific to firms, and then we can improve on her design principles? That would be nice.
So if there's some doctoral student out there watching this video and thinking, oh, I like this framework, I like this topic, I might like to do my dissertation on this, perhaps as a test of this theory, what advice would you give to that person? Where should they go looking for the kinds of data, for example, that would be necessary to test the propositions that you have in the paper?
Yeah, so I mean, there are already case studies of networks of stakeholders. I think that would be really good to either look again at these case studies from a governance angle, because they haven't really been looked at in that way, or collect new information for other cases. That would be very useful. And to see the intricacies, how and also the processes in practice. How do they negotiate the rules? How does power play a role in these relationships, which we don't touch upon much in the paper? So I think that this would be a fantastic ways forward in terms of empirical work. The issues are so big that I don't immediately see quantitative work, but I mean, maybe my imagination is limited and others have. I have a PhD student who might have access to data that will allow some comparative work on a number of cases of shareholders coming together to try to influence firms, comparative case studies that there are possible, but you need then the data collected by others and have access to it. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's about all the questions I have for today. So let me just say thank you very much for sitting for this interview and taking some time out of your evening to talk about the paper and where it came from, and to give some helpful advice and guidance to future theorists who may want to publish in AMR. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich, for your time too.
Oh,
Very much appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.